Point and Click Productions, Portland Mindfulness Therapy, and your host, me, myself, and I, Joe Reinwein, present Zen and Paradox. Now, long before I ever knew much of anything about Buddhism or even psychology, round about age 12, I ran across something called Zen comics. And this immediately appealed to me, this now classic series of 2 books of cartoons about Zen based on the ancient stories, mostly interactions between student and teacher, which that dialogical process, having been recorded in stories, comprises a good deal of Zen Buddhist literature, at least, and I think other Buddhist literature as well. And in these comics, one of the things that really appealed to me was the humor, either sometimes intentional humor, I believe, and other times maybe I was seeing the humor in it. From my standpoint, it was intriguing and, to me, funny, so that the student would go to the master and say, "What is the Buddha?" And the master would answer something cryptic, like, I don't know, "The swans have just flown away." And then the student says something else, and then the master hits the student on the head with a stick. And the student has great awakening, and their life is forever transformed. I thought this was hilarious. And I thought, if there's anything out there that might actually be legit, it probably looks like this. Because at 12, I already had a pretty good sense of life being absurd. And so if there is a process of transcendence available, it's probably pretty strange. Might look something like that. Well, as I, over the years, delved just a little bit deeper into the literature before I actually started practicing meditation and then attending a Zen Buddhist community, working with a teacher, all that kind of stuff, I continue to be intrigued, maybe on a somewhat deeper level, by all the paradoxes, the seeming paradoxes that Zen explores. And this teaching technique, this pedagogy of isolating and highlighting paradoxes seems maybe not unique to Zen, but a hallmark of Zen teaching style. And emblematic in the, or say typical in the well-known koan, "What is the sound of one hand?" Often misquoted, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" So the idea of struggling with paradox to arrive at a higher truth, similar to Hegelian dialectics, as is employed in dialectical behavior therapy and in Marxism and in many intellectual approaches in the West. You have a thesis, an antithesis, and they combine, they crash together, and they struggle, and then boom, we have a precipitate, we have a synthesis that drops out of that. Something like that is going on in Zen, which is why in dialectical behavior therapy, Marshall Linehan wanted to call it Zen therapy, and then someone pointed out, hey, actually, you know, it might be more marketable if you call it dialectical behavior therapy. It doesn't sound as fruity and woo-woo, and you have a basis in Western philosophy. Now, that having been said, let's look at this issue of paradox, perhaps by looking at the Heart Sutra. The Heart Sutra is probably the most beloved sutra of Zen, the sutras being the sacred texts, some of the most important sacred texts of Buddhism, generally thought to be penned by the Buddha, or at least people around the Buddha, recording often dialogues between the historical Buddha and a student, often one of his top students, Ananda. And the Heart Sutra, though, is in the form of a monologue, but in response, it's in the second person to Shariputra. And I'll leave it to you scholars to tell us who Shariputra is. The one speaking is supposed to be Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva. And Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, say that 10 times fast, is a manifestation of pure compassion who eventually became Guanyin in Chinese Buddhism, Guanyin represented usually as a figure much like this. A female, Avalokiteshvara, was generally represented as a male. However, the central point here being that the Heart Sutra goes through all the principles of Buddhism, kind of like some of the things that we've been doing, somewhat randomly, somewhat systematically. But it goes through the Four Noble Truths and other basic aspects of Buddhism and annihilates them and says, these aren't true, or they're neither true nor false. For example, the Four Noble Truths, which we've not dealt with head on yet in any of my videos, I don't think, but we've touched on. First Noble Truth that life is suffering. The second Noble Truth that there is a reason for this suffering, and the reason is ignorance. And the third, that there is annihilation of suffering. There is a way to transcend it, and it can end. And the fourth is that, well, here's the Eightfold Path. Here's how you do it. So one of the lines of the Heart Sutra is no suffering, no cause of suffering, no extinguishing of suffering, and no path, no wisdom, and no gain. And then it goes on to say, thus the enlightened one, or the bodhisattva, the enlightened person, relies on prajna paramita, the wisdom, relies on wisdom. And it goes on from there. It's a relatively brief text. I would encourage anyone interested to look it up. But it's a brief and readily memorized by those of us who might chant it on a regular basis in a community. But it is infinitely deep and complex and subtle, or so we tell ourselves in Buddhism, and I think it's true. Obviously, I believe that. The dual nature of reality is one of the things that Zen Buddhism seems to be about, and one of the things that the Heart Sutra points at. So, in my video on dukkha, suffering, we talk about sickness, old age, death, impermanence, these things that seem to cause us suffering. And one of the things that the Heart Sutra is saying is that there is and there is not sickness, there is and there is not old age, and there is not death. And that is hard to understand. It's really hard to understand. One of the ways to talk and think about it on a basic level might be that everything we experience through our perceptual apparatus, and then the processing, the cognition about what we have perceived. So to make this a little more concrete, back to looking at concrete objects in the world, there is a glass here, and in many very practical ways, it exists. For instance, I can do this. Get a little bit of water. Good break from my coffee. There is a glass here, and yet in other ways there is not a glass here. If I were to throw the glass against the wall and it were to shatter into a million pieces, is it still a glass? Not really. It doesn't function as a glass. If I were asleep and didn't notice the glass, then for all intents and purposes, the glass is not there to me. If I were blind and didn't see the glass would not be there. We in the West, and actually we human beings in general, will tend to think of the glass as having an existence in itself, apart from everything else. In other words, if I'm asleep, most people would say, the glass is really there. It's just that you're asleep. Okay. And that is one side of things, that there is an objective reality. The other side of things is really difficult to talk about, but let's take something a little less concrete, like aging. So aging of the body exists, but if we are not identified with the body, if the body feels to us to be just like an article of clothing, not something that we overly value or strongly identify with, as it ages, we are untroubled. And in that sense, aging does not exist. Death itself, if death is the cessation of consciousness, which is debatable, but if it is, we're not going to really be there when it happens. We'll be there right before, but then when it happens, then we're not thinking anymore. And generally, to have an event happen, it seems like we have to have a prologue, the event, and then an epilogue to create a story around it. And if there's an event that ends all events for us, it's sort of a non-event. It's kind of like contemplating what happens if a giant asteroid hits the Earth and instantly everyone is gone. Everything is gone. In a way, in a certain way, it doesn't matter, because there's no one there to reflect upon the fact that everyone is gone. These matters are deep. I am not an expert on these matters, but I wanted to try to point to them in the best way I can. And maybe another way that I could point to them is to talk about quaternary logic. So in Buddhism, so I'm given to understand, logic is seen as fourfold rather than twofold. In Western logic, symbolic logic, various forms of logic that underlie our mathematical systems and our philosophical systems, we have a principle that says A is A, and A is not A. So something either is or isn't, what have you. In predicate logic, you can talk about A is blue. If I'm remembering correctly, that would be a predicate. It's either blue or it isn't blue. It's not both blue and not blue. But let's look at that for a second. On the face of it, that should be convincing that things either are or aren't what they are. Either this is a stone, or it isn't a stone. In Buddhist logic, generally speaking, quaternary logic says that something is A or it's not A, or it's both A and not A, or it's neither A nor not A. Now, it turns out, in my humble opinion and experience, that this kind of logic applies particularly well when we're talking about things that are a little less abstract. When we're talking about something like a stone, yes, we can still apply this kind of logic, but I think it works a little better to say, you know, is this made of quartz or is it not made of quartz? You know, is this predominantly silicon oxide or is it not predominantly silicon oxide? And it's hard to see how that would be really useful to make that quaternary. Although we can get back to this example, because even in mineralogy, there are shades between various categories. But when we talk about something more abstract, then it gets much more useful pretty quickly. Before we get there, let's take an example of something that is concrete that might help us get there. So for instance, is a tomato a fruit? Well, a tomato is and isn't a fruit, depending upon how we're defining fruit. If we're talking about fruit as a culinary category, does a tomato add a lot of bright sweetness instantly? I mean, yeah, if you boil down a tomato, it'll be sweet. But if you just cut up a tomato and throw it into a salad, is it going to make the salad really sweet, like an apple would? No, not really. So culinarily, a tomato would be considered a vegetable. But we know biologically it is very much a fruit. So in this sense, a tomato is both a fruit and not a fruit. Now, if we go to something more abstract, Let's say I had a little interaction with one of my viewers who said, well, I don't think life sucks. Okay, this is the realm of opinion, this is the realm of judgment, and here's where quaternary logic works very well. Does life suck? Is life suffering? Is the First Noble Truth true? Well, it is true, and it isn't true. Both. So it is true that life is suffused with unpleasant and aversive experiences. They happen every day. I did one take of this video. I'm called Point and Click. I call myself Point and Click because I don't redo videos. It's not only point and click, it's one shot, usually. But, you know, in the prior shot I took, I was stumbling on my words a lot, and I took a sip of coffee, and I choked on it. And, you know, stuff like that happens all day, every day. And people die. And we go through grief, as another one of my viewers described so beautifully in the loss of her mother, and in the eventual transcendence from pain that led to, through enormous pain. So, is life suffering? Look, the Buddha, as I described in the story twice, did not want to teach this stuff. The Buddha's first reaction after experiencing a massive enlightenment experience was, I ain't going to teach this to nobody, because this stuff's too hard. This is too subtle. Nobody's going to understand what I'm talking about. So what he did, assuming he was a historical figure, which I think he was very clever, is he set up a system that was concrete. Life is suffering. First Noble Truth, life is suffering. Second Noble Truth, there's a cause for that suffering, and it causes ignorance. Third Noble Truth is that we can end ignorance and thereby end suffering. There can be extinguishing of suffering. And the fourth is the Eightfold Path. Here's how you do it. And then he said, and from another standpoint, none of these things are real. Now, as we go a little deeper into Zen philosophy, and as I'm rambling, I see I'm moving up on towards the 20-minute mark, which is about as long as anyone is going to want to listen to any of this stuff from me, I would think, at a time. So we go a little deeper in Zen philosophy. This transcendence explains a lot of the paradox, that the paradoxes are apparent because we live in a dualistic way. We live in a dualistic way. We think of things as either this or that. But things are what they are. They're not how we think of them. They are what they are, let's say. And there are two ways of being in Zen. One known as the relative, the other as the absolute. Maybe I should have started the video here, but for my loyal viewers who have slogged through this whole video, let's leave the treat for the end. I don't know if it's such a treat, but at least it's one of the most relevant and important things I'm going to say in this video. Saving it for the end, I had that planned all along. The relative and the absolute. And the relative is the world as we know it. The relative is the world where I am separate from the world. There's me, and then there's cups of coffee, and then there's rocks, and then there's people out there who aren't me, and everything is divided into me, not me, black, white, up, down, and so forth. And that's actually called the relative, because up is only up relative to down, and so forth. The absolute is, for most of us, a more exotic thing, generally encountered in deep states of meditation, such as that described in the Heart Sutra. And in the absolute, all these dualistic things fall away, and there's just being. Now here's the thing. When there are no differentiations and we're just being, we can't do anything. The moment we start doing something, we start dividing the world into I and it. I pick up it. I pick up the it in question here being the cup of coffee. I drink it. And the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber talks a lot about the aspects of what life is like when we relate to the world in that objective way, I, it, as opposed to what Martin Buber called I, you. And I, you is more like what the Buddhists are talking about when they talk about the absolute, that all is one. And the path of Zen Buddhism, at least as I'm given to understand it, is to learn to see the absolute and then to merge in, after many, many years of practice, gradually merge the relative and absolute into a seamless whole in our everyday life. I feel a little out of my depth. I almost feel a little guilty talking about this stuff. However, I think it's important, and I will talk about it. And I think this deserves another video or two to try to explicate a little more what on earth I might be talking about. Until then, may your life go well.